The suitcase never went into the closet. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Greta Morrow, if they noticed anything at all. 7 families in 20 years, and not one of them ever saw her hang a single piece of clothing on a hanger that belonged to the house. She kept everything folded, everything layered, everything ready, not because she was tidy by nature, because she had learned the hard way, and more than once, that the distance between staying and leaving was almost always shorter than it looked. She was 24 years old and she had been packing to leave since she was 9. The apartment in Nashville was small enough that the suitcase lived beside the bed like a faithful dog. Brown leather scuffed at the corners, the handle worn smooth by too many hands in too many parking lots of too many group homes. It had followed her out of the Davidson County foster system through 2 community college semesters. She never finished, and into the rhythm of double shifts at a diner on Charlotte Avenue, where the coffee was strong and the tips were honest, and nobody asked too many questions about where she came from. She liked it that way. Questions led to explanations, and explanations led to the particular kind of pity that settled on a person like a second skin and never quite came off. On a Tuesday morning in early October, Greta stood in front of the kitchen counter at 6:15 in the morning, a coffee cup in hand, and looked at the white envelope she had not opened in 2 days. It had arrived on a Sunday. The return address said Mercer and Associates Attorneys at Law, Cookeville, Tennessee. It was addressed to her specifically, her full legal name, printed in clean serif type, which meant someone had gone to the trouble of finding her. People who went to the trouble of finding Greta Morrow usually wanted something from her, and what they wanted was almost never simple. She had set it on the counter when it arrived. She had moved it to the windowsill. She had moved it back. She had stood in front of it twice on Monday between shifts and decided both times that it could wait. It was not that she feared bad news. Bad news had been arriving her entire life in one form or another, and she had developed a functional relationship with it. What she feared in the quiet and honest place she rarely visited was good news. Good news had conditions. Good news arrived with requirements she had never been able to meet. Good news was the thing that made leaving harder, and she had spent the better part of her life learning not to make leaving harder. She set down her coffee cup, picked up the envelope, and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, formal and careful, written in the measured language of legal offices. A man named Leroy Ashby had passed away on the 14th of September. He was 78 years old. He had been a resident of Harlan County, Tennessee, for the majority of his adult life, and for reasons the letter did not immediately explain, his last will and testament directed that a specific piece of property be transferred to Greta Morrow of Nashville, Tennessee. She read the name again, Leroy Ashby. She turned it over in her mind in the way you turn a coin over, looking for something you missed the first time. Nothing. No memory, no association, no flicker of recognition. As far as she knew, she had no family. As far as she knew, no one in the world had any legal obligation to think about her at all. She reached into the envelope, and a small object slipped into her palm. A key, brass-old, heavy in the way that old things are heavy, as if they have absorbed the weight of every year they have survived. The bow was worn smooth, the blade dark with age. Someone had held this key many times. Many more times than a person holds a key to a place they never visit. Attached to the bow by a thin loop of twine was a folded square of paper. The handwriting on it moved across the page in careful strokes that trembled slightly at the edges, the way handwriting trembles when the person holding the pen is running out of time. 6 words. It is time you knew the truth. Greta stood in her kitchen for a long moment with the key in one hand and the note in the other. The coffee cooled beside her. Outside, Nashville was doing what Nashville did in October, moving and loud and completely indifferent. She thought about the 7 bedrooms she had slept in as a child and the 7 different windows she had looked out of on 7 different mornings. She thought about the question she had carried so long, it had stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like weather, something you lived inside of without expecting it to change. If they loved me, why did no one ever come back? She put the key in her jacket pocket. She called in to say she would need a few days. She did not pack the suitcase because the suitcase was already packed. The phone rang before she reached the door. The number was unfamiliar, a Tennessee area code, but not one she recognized. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. The voice on the other end was a woman's, polished and precise, the kind of voice that had spent years in conference rooms making difficult things sound reasonable. Miss Morrow, my name is Ophelia Brierly. I'm an attorney representing several parties with a legal interest in the Ashby estate. I want to be direct with you because I think that serves everyone better. We would like to offer you a settlement in exchange for your agreement to decline the inheritance." Greta said nothing for a moment. A settlement, a financial arrangement, reasonable and fair. The property in question is complicated by ongoing legal considerations, and it would simplify matters considerably if you chose not to become involved. "You're offering me money," Greta said, "to not accept something I don't know anything about yet." "That's correct." She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because in 30 seconds, a stranger had managed to make her more curious about a dead man's property in rural Tennessee than she had been about anything in recent memory. "I'll be in touch if I have questions," she said. She ended the call before Ophelia Brierly could respond. For a moment, she stood with her hand on the door. She could put the key on the counter. She could call the attorney's office, decline politely, and go back to the diner on Charlotte Avenue and the suitcase that lived beside her bed. That would be the sensible thing. She had made sensible choices her whole life, and they had left her standing alone in a parking lot on her 18th birthday with a cupcake and a candle, and no one to tell her what to wish for. She opened the door and walked out into the October morning. The drive from Nashville to Harlan County took a little over 2 hours, moving east through the Cumberland Plateau as the land rose and the trees thickened and the highway narrowed into state routes and the state routes narrowed into county roads. By the time the GPS began losing confidence, the world outside the windows had changed completely. The hills here were old in a way that cities never are, patient and unhurried, layered in amber and gold, beneath an October sky that looked like it had been painted specifically for this day. The GPS said she had arrived when there was nothing visible but 2 lines of trees and a gravel pull-off on the shoulder. She got out of the car. She almost missed this gate entirely. It had settled deep into the vegetation on either side, iron gone the color of dried blood. One hinge broken so that it listed permanently open at an angle. Beyond it, a narrow path of pressed grass led through a field toward what she could just make out as a building. She walked toward it. The schoolhouse appeared gradually assembling itself piece by piece as she drew closer. One room, white clapboard siding with the paint coming away in long, curling strips. 4 windows on each long wall, several panes cracked along diagonal lines. A small bell tower at the near end, leaning slightly to one side, as if it had been leaning so long it had forgotten the alternative. She stopped walking. The grass around the building was cut. Not recently, not in the last week, but cut with regularity, maintained by someone who had been coming here with intention. 40 years since the last student walked through that door, according to the attorney's letter, and someone had been keeping the lawn. Someone who was not Leroy Ashby, because Leroy Ashby was gone. She stood at the edge of the mowed grass and felt something she had no immediate name for. Not quite recognition, because she had never been here. Something older than recognition. The feeling of arriving somewhere you have always known existed without knowing you knew. The door was secured by an iron padlock, old and heavy. She took the brass key from her pocket. The keyway matched. She turned it slowly and felt the resistance of decades before the mechanism gave way with a sound like a single note played on an instrument she had never heard before. The door swung inward. The air that came out was cool and still, carrying the smell of old wood and older paper, the particular scent of a place that has been undisturbed for a very long time. Greta stepped through the doorway. Afternoon light poured through the tall windows in long, angled columns, illuminating thousands of dust particles suspended in the air. She had expected emptiness. What she found instead was a room that seemed to be waiting. The desks were still there, 24 of them arranged in 4 rows, small and low to the ground, the kind built for children who are still learning how much space they take up in the world. She walked between them slowly. Some of the desktops had initials carved into the wood, small and deliberate, the permanent records of children who had wanted to leave some evidence that they had been here, that they had mattered in this particular place on this particular afternoon. She ran her fingers across one of the carvings. RT. She didn't know who RT was. She suspected no one alive did. At the front of the room, a blackboard stretched the full width of the wall. The chalk marks on it were still faintly visible, pale ghosts of letters and numbers from a Tuesday or a Thursday 4 decades ago. In the lower right corner, someone had written a date in larger letters. September 14th, 1982. The last day. The teacher's desk stood before the blackboard, and this was the thing that changed the texture of everything else in the room. While every other surface in the schoolhouse wore a uniform coat of dust, the desk was clean. Not recently clean, not wiped down this morning, but clean in the way that something is clean when it has been cared for consistently over a long period of time. No cobwebs in the corners of its legs, no film on its surface. Someone had been tending this desk, the same person perhaps who kept cutting the grass. On top of it sat a framed photograph. A man in his mid-70s, lean and straight-backed, standing with a group of children in front of a building she recognized now as this one. The children were laughing. The man was smiling with his eyes in the way that some people smile, where the expression reaches the face only as evidence of something happening deeper inside. Leroy Ashby. She looked at him for a long time. There was something in his face that she found difficult to describe. Steadiness, perhaps? The quality of a person who has decided what they believe and then organized their entire life around that decision without needing anyone else to confirm it. Beside the photograph, a small envelope, her name on the front in the same trembling handwriting as the note on the key. For Greta. She opened it. The message inside was short, written on a single sheet of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had begun to separate. If you are reading this, then I have run out of time. There are things you deserve to know, things that should have been told to you long ago and were not for reasons that made sense then and may be painful now. The answers you are looking for are here, but you will have to find them. Start where all stories begin. Start with the children. She read it twice. Then she looked around the room at the empty desks, at the carved initials, at the chalk ghosts on the blackboard. Then her eyes moved to the far corner, where a tall wooden filing cabinet stood against the wall. Unlike everything else, it was secured by a lock identical to the one on the front door. She crossed the room. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The top drawer held hundreds of student records going back to the early 1940s, each folder labeled in careful handwriting, each containing the accumulated documentation of a child's time in this building. Names, ages, attendance records, report cards, photographs. She moved through them slowly, pulling folders at random, reading fragments of lives. Here was a boy named Thomas who had perfect attendance in 1957 and drew airplanes in the margins of his worksheets. Here was a girl who had been absent for 3 weeks in the spring of 1961 and then returned to school and is noted by her teacher as quieter than before. She was reaching for another folder when she noticed it. At the very back of the bottom drawer, the wooden panel that formed the rear wall of the cabinet sat slightly proud of the frame, a gap of perhaps 1/8 of an inch along the top edge that should not have been there. She pressed her fingers against it. It moved. Behind the false panel was a compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside it was a book. Brown leather cover cracked along the spine, the corners soft with handling. No title on the cover, no markings of any kind. She lifted it out. It was heavy the way something is heavy when it contains more than the sum of its physical parts. A folded note rested on top of it, the same handwriting, the same careful strokes, pulling slightly at the ends. Some children are forgotten by the world. Others are hidden in order to protect them. Before you judge what happened to you, read this. A knot formed at the base of her throat. She opened the book. The first page read in the same handwriting, the orphan register. Below that title, a list began, hundreds of names organized by year, each entry containing a name, a birth year, a status note written in Ashby's precise hand. She turned the pages slowly. The room darkened around her as the afternoon moved on. She kept reading. Some entries were brief, one line, a name and a date in a single word. Safe. Others ran to half a page describing in careful language the circumstances under which a child had come to be recorded in this book, the arrangements that had been made, the people who had helped. Placed with relatives in another county, identity documentation updated, family confirmed. Transferred with the assistance of Reverend Matthew St. Andrew's Church, Knoxville. The deeper she read, the more certain she became that this was not a school register. Or not only a school register, this was a record of something else entirely. Something that had used this schoolhouse as its address without ever putting a sign on the door. She turned another page and another, and then she stopped. The room seemed to contract around her. The dust in the air, the creak of the floor, the October light going orange through the windows. All of it receded until there was nothing in the world except the page in her hands and the line of faded ink in the middle of it. Greta Morrow, age 4. Status must be protected at all costs. She read it 3 times. She read it a 4th time to make sure the light was not deceiving her, that the letters were what she thought they were, that her own name was in fact on this page, in a book, in a schoolhouse in the Tennessee hills that she had never visited before today. She made it to the nearest desk before her legs made the decision without consulting her. She sat down in the small wooden chair, her knees higher than the desktop, the register open in her lap, and she looked at her name written by a hand she did not recognize, in a book she had never seen in a place she had no memory of. And she understood that the story she had been telling herself for 20 years, the only story she had, was not the complete story. Someone had known she existed. Someone had written her name in this book. Someone had decided she needed protecting, and then had protected her without ever introducing themselves, without ever asking for acknowledgement or thanks. She sat in the small chair for a long time. The October light faded toward evening. She did not move. The knock came without warning. 3 sharp raps on the door, evenly spaced, not urgent but deliberate. She nearly dropped the register. Her heart moved into her throat so quickly she could feel it there. She set the book on the desk carefully and walked to the door. The man on the other side was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had spent significant time outdoors. He wore a uniform. The badge on his chest read, Sheriff Harlan County. His hands were at his sides, his posture relaxed in the specific way that people who hold authority are relaxed, aware that the situation is under control, without needing to demonstrate why. Miss Morrow. He said her name without surprise, which was the first thing she noticed. Not as a question, as confirmation. Sheriff. She did not open the door wider. Hank Calloway. He offered the name without offering a hand to shake. I heard someone was out at the old Ashby property, wanted to come by and make sure everything was in order. Who told you I was here? This is a small county. He said it pleasantly as if that were a complete answer. People notice things. His eyes moved past her shoulder into the interior of the building, a quick and practiced glance. This property has a history that's a little complicated. Some ongoing considerations about the estate. I'd hate for you to get into the middle of something you weren't prepared for. She studied his face. The pleasantness was real, she thought. It was also like most things that are pleasant without apparent reason, covering something else. What kind of considerations, she asked. Legal matters. Nothing that would affect a reasonable person who decided to let the professionals handle things. He paused. I'd strongly recommend not disturbing any of the files or documents that might be on the property until the situation is clarified. There it was. The second warning in 4 hours from the second person who had known how to find her. I appreciate the advice, she said. I'll be sure to consult my attorney. Calloway nodded, smiled with his mouth, and walked back to his cruiser without another word. She watched the vehicle move down the dirt track until the trees absorbed it, and then she stood in the doorway for another full minute after that, listening to the silence it left behind. She went back inside. She locked the door. She looked at the register on the small desk, at her name on the page, at the 4 words beside it. Must be protected at all costs. She had been here for less than 3 hours, and 2 different people had told her in 2 different ways to leave. Ophelia Brierly had offered her money. Hank Calloway had offered her a warning dressed as concern. Both of them had known who she was before she said a word. Both of them had arrived at this property in the years since Ashby's death with something to protect. Whatever Leroy Ashby had left her, it was not simply a building in the hills. She did not sleep in the schoolhouse that night. She drove into town, found a motel with a working heater and a parking lot she could see from the window, and lay on top of the bedspread with her jacket still on and the brass key on the nightstand beside her. She had expected to be unable to sleep. Instead, she was out within minutes, deeper than she had slept in months, and she did not dream. The knock at the schoolhouse door the next morning was different from the one the evening before. Lighter, unhurried, the knock of someone who had come with no intention of forcing anything. The woman on the threshold was in her early 80s, silver-haired, wearing a blue cardigan over a pale blouse, leaning on a wooden cane that had been polished smooth by years of use. She had the kind of face that held the record of everything that had ever happened to it, the lines of laughter and grief mapped across it with equal depth. She looked at Greta, and her eyes filled with tears, not with surprise, not with the relief of someone who has found something they were uncertain they would find. With recognition immediate and complete the recognition of someone who has been expecting this moment for a very long time and has been afraid until just now that it might not come. "Oh," she said softly. It was barely a word, more like a breath that had been held too long finally releasing. "You have your mother's eyes." No one had ever said that to Greta. In 24 years, no one had ever placed her in relationship to another human being through something as simple and fundamental as the shape of her eyes. She was always defined by what she lacked, by the gaps in her documentation, by the missing lines in the forms that social workers tried to fill in with whatever information existed. No one had ever looked at her and seen a woman who was not in the room. The visitor pressed one hand gently against her own chest, steadying herself. "My name is Marin Ashford. I've been waiting 20 years to meet you, Greta." They sat at the teacher's desk with Marin's coat folded over the back of the chair, and 2 cups of coffee in paper cups from a gas station in town, and Marin talked in the quiet voice of someone finally setting down something they have carried for a very long distance. She had known Leroy Ashby for 40 years. She had been the school secretary here when the building was still operating, had locked up with him on the last day of classes. In September of 1982, had watched him stay on after everyone else moved away or moved on. She had known Douglas and Florence Morrow. She had watched what happened to them, and she had kept the promises that needed keeping after they were gone. "He loved this place," she said, looking around the room. "Not the building, what it meant, what it could still mean." She paused. "He stayed because of the promise he made to your parents." Greta felt the weight of that sentence settle across her shoulders. "What promise?" Marin reached into her bag and placed on the desk a bundle of envelopes held together with a faded blue ribbon. They were bound so densely that the bundle was nearly an inch thick, dozens of envelopes, each one marked with a date in handwriting Greta now recognized as Leroy Ashby's. "Your life," Marin said simply. "Every birthday, every time you moved to a new home, every milestone Leroy could learn about. He documented all of it. He kept track." Greta stared at the envelopes. She counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The dates went back 20 years. "He watched over you," Marin continued, "not intrusively, not in a way that put you at risk. He simply made it his business to know you were safe." She touched the ribbon gently. "He never missed a birthday." Greta thought about the 20 years of birthdays she had spent believing she was invisible to the world. She thought about the parking lot at 18. She thought about 7 Christmas mornings and 7 different windows. Why didn't he come? The question came out smaller than she intended. "If he knew where I was, if he cared enough to do all of this." She stopped. Tried again. "Why didn't he come find me?" Marin's eyes shifted away from hers for just a moment, the way eyes shift when someone is deciding how much of a truth to share and in what order. "That," she said carefully, "is the hardest part of the story." She stood slowly and moved to the filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a thin folder tied with a different ribbon. This one blue and fraying at the edges, different from all the others. She carried it back to the desk and set it in front of Greta without opening it. "Leroy believed that some things need to be understood in a certain order," she said. "He spent a long time thinking about how to tell you this. He was afraid that if you learned the end before the middle, you would only hear the part that hurt." Greta looked at the folder. "There's a compartment in this room you haven't found yet," Marin said. "Read the letters in that bundle first. Then find it. When you do, bring what's inside back here, and I'll tell you what I know." She picked up her cane and her coat. "How will I know when I've found the right place?" Greta asked. Marin paused at the door. "You'll know because it will be the thing that looks most like it's trying not to be seen." She left. The door settled on its hinges. The schoolhouse went quiet again, and Greta sat at the teacher's desk with the bundle of letters under her hands, feeling the weight of them, the density of 2 decades of careful watching. She picked up the bundle and pulled the ribbon loose. The first letter was dated October 12th, the year of her 18th birthday. She recognized the year before she recognized anything else. She opened the envelope. Leroy Ashby's handwriting covered a single page, the letters leaning slightly forward, moving with a kind of disciplined urgency. "Today Greta turns 18. No one came for her. I wish I could have. I have wished that for 14 years. I hope that someday she understands that the distance between us was never indifference. Some distances are chosen for reasons that have nothing to do with how much a person is loved." She put the letter down on the desk. She put both hands flat on the surface beside it. Through the windows, the hills rolled away into the distance, under a sky that was beginning to go gray at the edges. The bell tower threw a long shadow across the floor. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full of something she did not yet have a word for. She picked up the next letter. The letter smelled like a house she had never lived in. That was the first thing Greta noticed when she untied the bundle. Not paper, not ink, not the particular staleness of things kept in envelopes for years. Something warmer than that, something she could not name and did not try to, because naming it would have required her to admit that it felt in some way that made no logical sense like home. She read through the night. Leroy Ashby had written in a voice that was precise without being cold, careful without being distant. He did not write about himself. He wrote about her, about a girl he had never met in homes he had never entered, living a life he could only observe from the careful distance of secondhand information and what could be learned from school attendance records and social services documentation that a man with enough patience and enough connections could over time piece together. He had written about the year she turned 7, when her teacher at Crestwood Elementary had noted in a progress report that she read above grade level and rarely asked for help even when she needed it. He had written about the year she turned 13, when the transfer to a 4th placement had happened in November, which he noted with particular care because November was a hard month to leave anywhere the holidays already visible on the horizon, and he had hoped in the letter's careful language that the new family would understand what the timing of that kind of disruption could do to a child who had already learned not to hope too loudly. He had written about the spring she turned 16 when he learned through a contact at the county office that she had taken a part-time job at a grocery store and was saving money in an account she had opened herself. He wrote that he had felt something close to pride and then had felt the precise pain of recognizing that pride was not his, to feel that he had not earned it, that it belonged to someone who had not been there. He had signed every letter the same way, not with his name, with 2 words, "Still watching." By the time the light outside the windows had gone from black to the deep gray that comes before dawn, Greta had read 31 letters covering 18 years. She had not cried at the Christmas memory from her childhood, which she had described to no one, and which Ashby had somehow known about anyway, noting in a letter dated that December only that he had learned from a source he did not name that the holiday had been difficult, and that he was sorry, and that he wished he could explain why he could not come, and that the explanation was coming, and that she would understand it when it did. She was 30 letters in before she realized her face was wet. She did not wipe it. She sat in the dim schoolhouse with Leroy Ashby's letters in her lap and let it happen because it seemed important not to interrupt it, because this particular grief had been waiting 20 years to move through her and it deserved the full passage. When it was done, she sat still and looked at the teacher's desk and thought about the one thing she could not make fit. He had cared. The evidence was irrefutable. 31 letters, deep, 18 years of documentation. He had cared in a way that most people who are present for a child's life do not care. He had cared from a distance that should have made caring impossible, and he had sustained it across 2 decades without acknowledgement or return. So why had he never come? Marin arrived at 8 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag containing biscuits she had made herself. She took one look at Greta's face and set everything on the desk without saying a word about what she saw there. They drank in silence for a moment. Outside, a thin rain had started, the kind that doesn't commit to being rain and doesn't commit to stopping. He called it the distance that wasn't indifference, Greta said finally. In the letters, he kept referencing an explanation. Something that was coming. Marin nodded. She was looking at her hands. He was afraid, she said. Not of you, not of what you would think of him. He was afraid that if he came before you, understood the whole story, you would hear only the part that made you angry. And he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the anger would close a door that needed to stay open. What door? Marin stood. She moved to the filing cabinet, the same bottom drawer she had opened the day before, and reached to the very back of it, behind the row of student folders, to a space Greta had not looked in because it had appeared to be solid wood. It was not solid wood. Behind a second false panel thinner than the first and fit more tightly into the frame was a narrow space. Inside it sat a folder, pale brown with age, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Marin carried it to the desk with both hands, the way you carry something you have been waiting a long time to put down. She placed it in front of Greta. Your parents wrote this, she said. Leroy kept it here because they asked him to. He never opened it after the first time. He believed it belonged to you. Greta looked at the folder. The ribbon was soft with age. She untied it slowly as if speed might disturb something. Inside were three things: a set of photographs, their edges sharp and uncreased, preserved well in the dry air of the cabinet. A collection of newspaper clippings folded carefully, some of them so old the paper had gone translucent, and a sealed envelope. On the front of it, in handwriting she did not recognize, but that hit her somewhere in the chest the moment she saw it. Three words: for Greta, someday. She set the photographs aside without looking at them. She set the clippings aside. She opened the envelope. The paper inside was stiff with age but intact. The letter was 2 pages handwritten, front and back, the penmanship, even, and deliberate, the handwriting of people who had been taught that how you wrote a thing said something about how seriously you took it. It began, "If you are reading this, then we were unable to come back for you." She kept reading. Douglas and Florence Morrow had spent 3 years working alongside federal investigators to document an operation that moved vulnerable children across state lines. The targets were children without advocates, children whose disappearance would generate paperwork, but not urgency. Children the system had already half forgotten before they were gone. Runaways, children in transitional placement, children between homes, between counties, between the cracks of a structure, built with good intentions and not enough resources. The deeper they went into the documentation, the more they understood about the scale of what they were looking at, and the more clearly they understood that the people involved were not strangers operating in shadows. Some of them held positions. Some of them had names that appeared in the newspaper in connection with civic awards and charitable donations and statements about the importance of protecting children. The surveillance began after the third year. They noticed it first as small things: a car parked too long on their street, a phone call that went quiet when answered, a source who had been reliable for 2 years and who stopped returning calls in the same week that a particular name appeared in the documentation for the first time. They made arrangements. Among those arrangements was a conversation with Leroy Ashby, who had been part of the network they worked with, who knew the landscape of child protection in that part of Tennessee in a way that almost no one else did, and who agreed without hesitation to do what needed to be done. Then came the sentence: "We ask that our identities be removed from your records." Greta read it once, then again. The words did not change. "We requested that no one tell you who we were." She put the letter down on the desk. She stood up. The chair caught on the floorboards. As she pushed back from the desk, a sharp wooden sound in the quiet room. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Marin, and her forehead almost touching the cold glass, looking out at the thin rain falling on the old field. "No." The word came out quiet and flat, the way a word comes out when the body is trying to contain something too large for it. Marin said nothing. They signed a piece of paper. Her voice was steady in the way that a voice is sometimes steady when the person using it has moved beyond the place where shaking is possible. They made a decision. They sat down together and decided that the best thing, the right thing, was to take their names out of my life. "Greta, I defended them." She turned from the window. "For 20 years, I defended them to myself. I told myself there had to be a reason. An accident. A mistake. Government records lost in a fire somewhere. I built a whole architecture around the idea that whatever happened was something that happened to them, not something they chose." She stopped. "And they chose." Marin looked at her steadily with an expression that was not pity and was not agreement and was not the look of someone who was about to tell her she was wrong. "Read the second letter," she said. "There isn't a second letter." Marin reached into the folder and produced a smaller envelope that had been tucked beneath the newspaper clipping so thin it was nearly invisible against the worn cardboard backing. She held it out. Greta did not move to take it. "Please," Marin said. It was a single word, but the weight behind it was not small. Greta crossed the room and took the envelope. It was smaller than the first, the paper inside folded once. The handwriting was the same, but faster, the letters less even, written by someone who had less time or less steadiness in their hands. It had been written, she would later calculate, 4 days before her parents died. The first line stopped her completely. "If our daughter grows up hating us, then our plan worked." She read it again. Her mind moved around the sentence, looking for another way to understand it, and found none. The letter continued. "Hatred heals. Grief heals. Dead children do not. If the people watching us believe that Greta is no longer connected to us, they will stop looking for her. If Greta believes we abandoned her, she will never go searching. She will live an ordinary life in an ordinary place, and no one will ever have reason to connect her to the work we were doing or the names we had found. She will be safe because she will appear to anyone who might look to have been discarded. We are not discarding her. We are hiding her in the only place we know to put her in the blind spot of people who would hurt a child to protect themselves. In the assumption that she doesn't matter. In the world's habit of forgetting. Leroy knows where the records are. If Greta ever comes back, she will need to see everything. The room became very still. Greta stood in the middle of it with the letter in both hands and felt the story she had built over 20 years come apart. Not violently, not all at once, but the way a structure comes apart when the thing holding it together turns out to have been the wrong material. Quietly and from the inside. They had not abandoned her. They had weaponized her own grief as a shield. They had made themselves into the kind of people their daughter would not come looking for, because a daughter who came looking could be used, could be found, could be leveraged by people who had demonstrated they were willing to do terrible things to protect information that inconvenienced them. They had loved her so much that they had chosen to be hated for it. She sat down on the floor, not at the desk, the floor. She sat down where she was standing, and Marin, to her credit, simply moved to sit beside her, lowering herself carefully and setting her cane across her knees, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was Greta who spoke first. Leroy knew all of this from the beginning, and he never told me because they asked him not to. Not until you found your way here. Not until you were ready to understand the whole thing. Marin paused. He believed you would come eventually. He didn't know when. He just kept the door open. Greta thought about the letters. 18 years of still watching. She thought about the key worn smooth by years of handling, by a man who had unlocked this building regularly, who had kept the grass cut and the desk clean and the register safe, waiting for a Tuesday morning when a 24-year-old woman who kept her clothes in a suitcase would drive east into the hills and put a brass key in a lock. She was still sitting on the floor when the sound of tires on gravel reached them from outside. She got up and looked through the window. A pickup truck she didn't recognize parking on the far edge of the field. The man who got out was in his late 30s, carrying a notebook and moving with the particular purposeful energy of someone who goes places not because they were invited, but because they have decided the story is there. She went to the door. "Beckett Grantham," he said before she could speak. He held up the notebook briefly, not as a credential, but as a statement of intention. "Nashville Tribune. I've been following the Ashby estate situation since the summer. I'm not giving interviews. I know, I'm not here for one." He looked past her at the building. "I wrote about this property 3 years ago. Ashby wouldn't speak to me. He was polite about it, but the answer was no." He brought his eyes back to her. "The next month, a deputy from this county filed a request to have the building inspected for code violations. First time in 40 years anyone from the county had paid attention to this place." Greta said nothing. "The deputy who filed the request was Leland Langford," Grantham continued. "He works under Hank Calloway. The inspection never happened. The request was withdrawn after 2 weeks." He paused. "I'd like to know why." "I'd like to know a lot of things," Greta said. "That doesn't mean I want to share them with a reporter." "Fair enough." He didn't move. "Hank Calloway drove past this property twice yesterday. I know because I was watching from the road. He didn't stop. He just drove past and kept going." Another pause. "Twice in the same afternoon is not a man doing his rounds." She studied him. He had the patient quality of someone accustomed to waiting, to understanding that information came to those who did not crowd it. "What do you want from me specifically?" she asked. "Access to what's in that building," he said. "In exchange for what I just know, which is more than you might think, and for resources you are going to need, which are more than you currently have." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. She closed the door without waiting for his response. That afternoon, following the instruction in the second letter, she began a systematic search of the building. Not the drawers she had already opened. Every surface, every seam, every place where the construction might conceal a space that was not meant to be seen. She found it under the floor. In the back corner of the room, behind the last row of desks, 3 floorboards had been secured with screws rather than nails, invisible, unless you were looking for the small difference in the seam pattern. She used a butter knife from her bag to work the screws loose and lifted the boards away. Below them was a metal box, its surface pocked with age, a label taped to the lid, so old that only one word remained legible: restricted. Inside the box were folders. More folders than the box should have been able to hold, each one thin and flat, organized by year with handwritten tabs. She brought them to the teacher's desk and began to read. The first folder contained altered documentation, a birth certificate with a name that had been typed over an erasure, a custody transfer record where a signature had been added in ink that did not quite match the surrounding text. The changes were subtle enough that they would pass a casual review and specific enough to tell her without any remaining doubt that someone had been deliberately modifying official records. The second folder, the third, the pattern held and expanded. Children had been moved through this county for years. Their identities adjusted, their histories quietly rewritten. Some of them were children fleeing documented abuse. Some of them were children whose families were under threat. Some of them were children whose original situations were described in language so careful and so restrained that she had to read between the lines to understand what it was describing, and when she did understand, she felt a cold and specific anger. Then she found the names, not the children's names, other names, names that appeared at the edges of the documentation, in the margins of investigation reports, in the CC lines of correspondence that should not have existed. The names of people who had signed off on transfers that were later altered. The names of officials who had declined to investigate complaints. The names of judges whose decisions had consistently favored outcomes that served the operation rather than the children it was supposedly protecting. Local names, county names, names she did not recognize but that carried in their documentation the specific gravity of people who had wielded and continued to wield real power in a real place. She was still reading when headlights crossed the window. She checked her watch, past 9. She had been reading for 4 hours without noticing. She went to the window. A county cruiser was parked at the edge of the field, engine running, lights on. Not moving, just parked there in the dark with the engine on, watching. She turned from the window and looked at the box of folders on the teacher's desk. At the documentation of 2 decades of protection and 2 decades of suppression, sitting in a building that 2 different people had told her to leave, and a county sheriff had driven past twice in an afternoon. She picked up her phone and called Beckett Grantham. He answered on the second ring. "I need you here tomorrow," she said. "Early." "What changed?" She looked at the box, at the names in the margins, at the documentation of what happened when power decided that a secret was worth the cost of a child. "Everything," she said. The next morning came bright and cold. Grantham arrived at 7 with a portable scanner and a hard drive and the name of an archivist at the University of Tennessee who could verify and securely store historical documentation. He came through the door, looked at the contents of the metal box spread across the teacher's desk, and went very quiet. Marin arrived 20 minutes later. She took one look at the folders and sat down slowly in the chair Greta had pulled up for her. "He kept more than I knew," she said. "How much of this did you know about?" Greta asked. "The network. The children they helped move. The promise keepers, that's what Leroy called them. Your parents were part of it from the beginning." She touched the edge of one of the folders without opening it. "I didn't know he had documentation of the other names. The ones on the wrong side." She paused. "If I had known, I would have been afraid." "You should be afraid now," Grantham said from across the room. He was photographing documents with his phone, moving quickly and methodically. "Some of these people are still in positions where they can do damage." He held up one page. On it, in Leroy Ashby's handwriting, was a list of case numbers and corresponding names. At the bottom, underlined twice, Hank Calloway. 2019 investigation, closed without explanation. Greta stared at the page. She heard the sound at the same time Grantham did, both of them going still, a car on the gravel outside. Then a door. Then footsteps on the porch. The knock was official. 3 sharp impacts, the knock of someone who carries the assumption that the door will open. She opened it. Hank Calloway stood on the threshold. Beside him, half a step back, was a younger man in the same uniform, mid-40s, with a face that was trying hard to hold a neutral expression and not entirely succeeding. His name tag read Langford. Miss Morrow. Calloway's pleasantness was gone. In its place was something cooler, more administrative. "I've received information that documents belonging to an active legal matter may be present on this property. I'd like to take a look." "Do you have a warrant?" Grantham said from behind her. Calloway's eyes moved to him. "And you are Beckett Grantham, Nashville Tribune." He said it the same way he had said it to Greta, not as a credential, but as a statement. Calloway looked back at Greta. "I'd strongly recommend you cooperate voluntarily. It would be better for everyone." She was about to respond when Langford spoke. "Sheriff," his voice was even carefully neutral, "we don't have a warrant, And the request to open a new investigation was filed 3 days ago. It hasn't been reviewed yet. He paused. We don't have legal grounds to request access today. Calloway turned to look at his deputy. Something passed between them that had the specific tension of a relationship where the balance of power was shifting in real time. Deputy Langford is right, Greta said. When you have a warrant, I'll have my attorney present. She met Calloway's eyes. I appreciate you stopping by. She closed the door. The silence inside the building lasted until the sound of the cruiser engine faded down the gravel track. Then Grantham exhaled slowly and turned back to the desk. Your deputy just contradicted his own sheriff, he said. I noticed. That doesn't happen by accident. She thought about the file with Calloway's name at the bottom. The 2019 investigation closed without explanation. The code violation request filed by Langford and then withdrawn. A man who had been waiting years for a reason to step to the other side of a line he had been standing uncomfortably close to. How long do we have before the warrant comes through? She asked Grantham. Depends on who signs it. If it's someone connected to the names in those folders, faster than you'd think. He was already moving scanner in hand. We need to get everything copied and off this property tonight. Marin stood and picked up her cane. Tell me what to do. They worked until 2 in the morning. Every document in the metal box photographed and scanned, every page of the register digitized, every photograph, every clipping, every letter. By the time they finished, Grantham had sent encrypted copies to the University of Tennessee archivist, to a historian colleague in Nashville, and to a single email address at the FBI field office that he had used twice before on matters that required someone to pay attention without being asked twice. When the last file was sent, Greta sat at the teacher's desk in the quiet, in the dark, the empty metal box in front of her. She picked up the photographs from her parents' folder, ones she had set aside without looking at when she opened it. There were 4 of them. 3 were formal, the kind of photographs that end up in Fell's identification photos, a staff picture from some organization, a group photograph she didn't look at long enough to fully register. The 4th was different. 2 people stood under a tree in what looked like summer. A man and a woman, both young, younger than she was now. They were laughing at something happening outside the frame, turned slightly toward each other, caught in the middle of a moment they had not prepared for. The photograph had the accidental quality of a real one, the particular quality of an image that captured something true rather than something posed. She turned it over, nothing on the back. She looked at it for a long time, at the man who was her father, at the woman who was her mother, at the 2 people who had made a decision. She was still not sure she fully understood in the service of a love. She was still not sure she could fully measure. She put the photograph face up on the desk and left it there where she could see it, and she did not put it away. The silence was broken by a sound outside. Not a car this time, just wind moving through the old trees at the edge of the field. She listened to it until it passed. Then she heard something else. Footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, singular. One person, moving carefully. Then a knock. Not official this time. 3 light taps, patient and unhurried. She looked at the clock. 3 in the morning. She crossed the room and opened the door. Leland Langford stood on the porch in civilian clothes, no uniform, no badge visible. He held a manila envelope in both hands, and he looked like a man who had made a decision some hours ago and had spent those hours making sure he was going to live with it. Deputy Langford, she said, just Leland tonight. He held out the envelope. There's something you need to see before the warrant comes through. It'll come through tomorrow. Whoever signs it owes Calloway a favor, and Calloway collected it this evening. He paused. What's in this envelope is why the 2019 investigation was closed. And it's why I filed that code violation request and then withdrew it when I realized I was being watched. He looked at her steadily. Ashby knew. He told me once years ago to wait. He said the right person would come eventually, and I would know them when I saw them. She took the envelope. He wasn't wrong, Langford said. He turned and walked back across the field toward the road, not hurrying a man who had put something down and was feeling the difference in his hands. She stood in the doorway and looked down at the envelope and understood that whatever was inside it would change the shape of everything she thought she knew about tomorrow. The envelope was not thick. That was the first thing she noticed standing in the doorway at 3 in the morning, with the field dark behind her and the schoolhouse light falling across the porch boards at her feet. Whatever Leland Langford had carried here, at an hour when carrying it, required a decision he could not take back. It was not a large document. It was the kind of an envelope that contains something small and specific, the kind of evidence that does not need volume to do damage. She went inside and sat at the teacher's desk and opened it. Inside were two items: a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of an internal memo from the county sheriff's office, dated March 2019, and a photograph. The memo was brief, 3 paragraphs, the language bureaucratic and clipped. It referenced a property inspection request that had been filed without authorization, and it directed that all activity related to the Ashby property in Harlan County be suspended pending review by the county attorney's office. It was signed by the county attorney. The name at the bottom of the signature line was Irving Pemberton. She looked at the photograph next. It showed 4 men standing in what appeared to be a restaurant or a private dining room, the lighting warm, the setting informal. She recognized Hank Calloway, younger by several years, standing with a drink in hand. She did not recognize the other 3 men. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she did not recognize, were 4 names and a date. The date was 6 weeks before the 2019 investigation into the Ashby property had been closed. Irving Pemberton's name was among the 4. She sat with this for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent Grantham a message with a photograph of both documents attached. His response came back in under 4 minutes, which meant he had not been sleeping either. She stared at the screen. He had written one sentence: Pemberton is Ophelia Brierly's primary client. The circle closed with an almost audible sound. Ophelia Brierly had called her within hours of the estate letter, omelet being sent offering money to walk away. Hank Calloway had appeared at the schoolhouse within a day of her arrival, offering warnings dressed as concern. The 2019 investigation had been shut down by a county attorney who appeared in a photograph with Calloway 6 weeks before the closure. And Ophelia Brierly, the attorney whose voice had been the first sound in this whole chain of events, represented the man who had signed the order to stop looking. Leroy Ashby had known all of this. He had documented it carefully and patiently over years, and he had hidden the documentation under a floor and waited for the right person to find it. She put the phone down and looked at the photograph of her parents on the desk. The 2 young people under the tree laughing at something outside the frame. She had left it there all night face up because she was not ready to put it away, and she was not sure she would ever be. She picked it up now and looked at it for a long time. They had understood something she was only beginning to understand: that some fights are not finished by the people who start them, that the work gets passed like a key on a piece of twine to whoever is willing to carry it next. She set the photograph down and began to write. By 7 in the morning, she had drafted a letter to the FBI field office in Nashville, more detailed than the initial contact Grantham had made, including the specific case numbers from Ashby's documentation, the names connected to the altered records, the timeline of the 2019 investigation and its closure, and the contents of the envelope Langford had delivered. She attached digital copies of every relevant document. She sent it, and then she sent a copy to a second address Grantham had given her, a contact at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division who had worked cases involving child welfare system manipulation before. Then she called Grantham. "The warrant," she said when he answered. "How long?" "I made some calls this morning. Pemberton signed off on the request last night, which means whoever the judge is owes either Pemberton or Calloway something. My best estimate is by noon." "Then we have until noon." The archive at UT confirmed receipt last night. Everything is verified and stored. They've assigned an academic reference number, which means it's officially part of the historical record. He paused. They can issue a warrant for the building. They can't unarchive what's already been verified by an independent institution. She stood at the window. The October morning was clear. The hills going red and gold. The sky, the particular shade of blue that only appears after a night of cold, has settled the air. "There's one more thing," she said. "Langford came here last night, alone out of uniform." A silence on the other end. "Then that's significant." He said Ashby told him to wait, that the right person would come and he would know them. Another pause, longer this time. "Are you going to use it?" She thought about Langford standing on the porch at 3 in the morning, with a decision already made, holding evidence that implicated his own superior, in a county where his own livelihood and possibly his safety depended on whose side of a line he appeared to be on. "Yes," she said, "but not without him knowing. He should be the one to decide how." She called Langford 20 minutes later. He picked up on the first ring. "I expected you'd call," he said. I sent copies to the FBI and to Justice last night. The documentation you brought is included. A breath on the other end. Not quite relief and not quite fear, something in between. All right. If Calloway finds out you came here last night, what happens to you? I've thought about that, Langford said. I've been thinking about it for about 7 years, honestly. What happens is whatever happens. I'm a little tired of letting what might happen be the reason I don't do things that need doing. She recognized that. The specific exhaustion of letting anticipated consequences govern everything. She had lived inside that exhaustion for most of her adult life and had only recently begun to understand what it cost. There may be people who want to talk to you, she said. Official people. I know. I'll be available. He paused. Miss Morrow, what Ashby kept in that building, the register, the files, the records. Those are real people, real families. I always knew that. I just didn't know what to do about it until now. You did something, she said. That matters. She ended the call and stood in the quiet room with the morning light moving across the floorboards. Ophelia Brierly arrived at 11:45. She came with a man Greta did not recognize. Dark suit briefcase, the look of someone whose entire professional identity was invested in the outcome of this particular hour. Ophelia herself moved through the room with the assurance of someone who had always found doors open. Grantham was already there. Marin had arrived an hour earlier and was sitting in the corner with her cane across her knees, watching the door with the patience of someone who has waited for things before and knows that waiting is not the same as losing. Ophelia looked at the room, at the teacher's desk cleared of everything, at the empty filing cabinet standing open, at Greta. We have a warrant, she said. She produced a document and held it out. Greta took it. She read it carefully. It was signed by a judge she did not know, countersigned by Irving Pemberton in his capacity as county attorney. It directed the immediate preservation and surrender of all documents, files, records, and personal property present on the Ashby estate, pending review in connection with an ongoing legal matter. She handed it back. I'd like you to note, for the record, she said, that this warrant was executed by a county attorney whose name appears in documentation already submitted to the FBI field office in Nashville and to the Department of Justice. That submission was made at approximately 7 this morning. She watched Ophelia's face. I'd also like you to note that every document this warrant is intended to collect was verified and archived by the University of Tennessee Special Collections Department at 2:14 this morning and has been assigned an academic reference number. It is part of the institutional historical record. Ophelia Brierly looked at her. The composure held, but something shifted behind it, a small and specific recalculation happening in real time. The physical documents, the man in the dark suit said, are also in the care of independent parties, Grantham said from across the room. As of this morning, Ophelia looked at the empty filing cabinet, at the cleared desk, at a room that contained everything it had always contained and nothing that could be removed to make a difference now. This isn't finished, she said. Her voice was still controlled, still professional. No, Greta agreed, it isn't. But the part where the records disappear is finished. She looked at Ophelia steadily, without anger, without performance. Just the clear-eyed look of someone who has decided. Whatever comes next goes through the proper channels, which I believe is what those channels are for. Ophelia Brierly left. The man in the dark suit followed. The sound of their car on the gravel was the sound of a particular kind of authority discovering its limit. Marin exhaled slowly from her corner. Leroy would have enjoyed that, she said. Grantham was already on his phone, moving toward the door. I need to make some calls. This is going to move fast now. He went out, and the room was suddenly quiet. The two women alone in the schoolhouse with the morning light and the open register on the teacher's desk, and 40 years of patience finally arriving at something. What happens now? Marin asked. I don't know exactly, Greta said, but the right people have the right information. What they do with it is their work. She sat down at the desk. Our work is something else. Marin nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for Greta to say exactly that. The article Grantham published 3 weeks later ran on the front page of the Nashville Tribune and was picked up by the wire services within 48 hours. It was careful and specific, naming names only where documentation supported the claim, describing the Promise Keepers Network not as a secret organization, but as what it had actually been, a collection of ordinary people, teachers and church leaders, and social workers and parents who had decided that the gap between what the system promised and what it delivered was a gap they could help fill. The responses began arriving at the schoolhouse before the week was out. Letters first, then emails forwarded through the Tribune, then phone calls to a number Greta had set up with the help of a retired social worker Maren knew who had been doing this kind of reconnection work for years and agreed without hesitation to help when she understood what the register contained. A woman in her 70s from Memphis who had spent 58 years trying to find a brother who had entered the foster system in 1965 and disappeared from the official record 2 years later. A man in his 60s from Chattanooga whose adoption had been closed and who had carried his original birth name written on a piece of paper in his wallet for 4 decades because he was afraid that if he stopped carrying it, he would forget something essential about who he had been before. A family in eastern Kentucky who had lost track of a grandmother's sister during the upheaval of the 1970s and had been searching with decreasing hope through genealogy databases for years. Greta worked through them in the order they arrived methodically with the retired social worker, and with Maren and with a graduate student from the UT archive who had become personally invested in the project and came on weekends without being asked. Not every search succeeded. Some of the names in the register led to records that ended in ways that could not be changed. Some of the families were looking for people who were not there to be found, but some of them were. The reunion between the woman from Memphis and her brother happened through a video call on a Thursday afternoon in November, 6 weeks after the article ran. He was 73 years old and living in Arizona and had been searching in his own way for most of his adult life, carrying a photograph from their childhood that he had kept in a frame on his desk through 4 decades in 2 states and more moves than he could readily account for. Greta was in the room when the call connected. She watched the moment the 2 faces appeared on the screen and recognized each other across 58 years. And the particular silence that falls when a thing that has been missing for that long is suddenly present again. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. They simply looked. 2 people in their 70s looking at the face they had last seen when they were children, finding it still there underneath the decades. When the words came, they came through tears, and the words were not remarkable words. They were the ordinary words of 2 people who had found each other, but the ordinary words of people who have been looking for most of their lives carry a weight that more elaborate language cannot approach. Greta stepped out of the room. She stood in the hallway of the building where this call was happening, a community center in Cookeville that had offered its conference room for the purpose, and she felt something move through her that she did not try to analyze or contain. It was the first time she had fully understood what the register was for. Not as a historical document, not as evidence, as a bridge between people who had been on opposite sides of a distance they had not chosen and could not cross alone. Leroy Ashby had understood this. He had built the bridge plank by plank over 40 years, keeping the records clean and the door open, waiting for the person who would know what to do with it. In the weeks that followed, 3 more reunions happened through the archive. A grandfather in Georgia who found documentation of a son placed for adoption in 1971 without his knowledge or consent. 2 cousins in Virginia who had grown up believing themselves to be the last of their family line and discovered through entries in the register 4 relatives still living in the same county their grandparents had left. An elderly man in West Virginia who had spent 30 years believing his younger sister had died in the foster system and learned through a cross-reference Greta found on a Saturday morning that she was alive and living 40 miles from him. Each of these moments moved through Greta in ways she did not try to catalog or contain. They were the proof of something she had not had language for when she first walked through the schoolhouse door. That the work mattered, that the keeping of records across decades of silence, and pressure and risk had not been abstract faithfulness but specific, consequential, life-changing faithfulness. Not every file in the archive led somewhere that could be called a resolution. Some names connected to records that ended without explanation, the trail going cold in the way trails go cold, when the people who could answer questions are no longer living or no longer willing. Some families arrived with hope and left with information that was accurate but not what they had needed it to be. A man in his 60s drove 3 hours from Louisville to ask about a mother who had placed him for adoption in 1963, and what Greta found in the files was not a living person, but a history, a documented series of events that explained the circumstances of his first years and named the people involved and left him at the end of a long afternoon in the schoolhouse, sitting quietly with a folder in his hands, and an expression that was not grief and was not relief, but was the particular expression of a person who has received an answer they will spend the rest of their life learning to carry. She stayed with him until he was ready to leave. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned in these months that silence was not always the absence of something. Sometimes it was the presence of something that had no other form. Leland Langford came by the schoolhouse one afternoon in late August, a few weeks before the opening ceremony. He was still on administrative leave, but the federal review had moved to a phase that his attorney described as favorable, which Langford himself translated in the parking lot outside the schoolhouse, as meaning that the people who needed to face consequences were beginning to face them. He did not stay long. He drank a cup of coffee at the teacher's desk and looked around the room and said without particular drama that he had filed the original code violation request in 2022 because he had found one of Ashby's notes tucked inside a procedural manual in the department's records room, a note that should not have been there, and that made clear to Langford in the careful, indirect language Ashby used when he was writing something he knew might be found by the wrong person, that the schoolhouse mattered and that someone needed to remember that it mattered. He had not understood why until now. Greta thought about that after he left, about the things Leroy Ashby had put in motion years before his death, the quiet preparations and the careful placements and the notes left in places where the right person might eventually find them. He had understood something she was still learning, that you cannot always be there yourself, that sometimes the best you can do is arrange things so that when the time comes, the people who need to act will have what they need to act with. Grantham stopped by that same week not for a story, but because he had received a letter from Irving Pemberton's attorney indicating that Pemberton intended to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for consideration on sentencing. Grantham read the letter aloud to Greta at the teacher's desk, and when he finished, they sat in silence for a moment. It was not a celebratory silence. It was the silence of people who understand that accountability, when it comes, rarely feels the way you imagined it would. It feels smaller and more procedural, and somehow more real for that. Outside, Marin was weeding the small gardens she had started along the south wall of the schoolhouse in early June, the first addition to the property that was purely hers, that had nothing to do with documentation or preservation or history, just flowers, the kind that came back every year without being asked. There was a question Greta returned to often during those months, not as an accusation, but as something she was genuinely trying to understand. She returned to it in the early mornings before anyone else arrived, standing at the window with coffee, watching the hills go from dark to gray to gold in the particular sequence that she now knew by heart. The question was this: how had Leroy Ashby kept going? Not in the sense of physical endurance, though. That was part of it. A man in his 60s and then 70s, maintaining a property alone, keeping files organized, tracking the life of a child he had never met. But in a deeper sense, how had he kept believing that the work mattered on the days when there was no evidence that it did? On the days when the register sat in its cabinet and the box of files sat under the floor, and the world continued to do what the world does, which is mostly to move forward without looking back at what it has left behind. She did not arrive at a full answer, but she arrived at part of one. He had believed in the specific gravity of individual names. Each entry in the register was not a case or a file or a statistic. It was a person. And Leroy Ashby had treated each name with the seriousness that a person deserves, which meant that the work could not be abandoned without abandoning the people behind the names, and that was something he had apparently decided early and definitively that he was not willing to do. She thought she understood that now, in a way, she could not have understood it 14 months ago. She had arrived at the schoolhouse asking whether she had been loved. She was leaving it slowly daily with the understanding that love was not always a feeling and not always a presence. Sometimes it was a practice. Sometimes it was 40 years of showing up to a building in the hills and keeping a desk clean and cutting the grass and writing letters that would never be sent and believing without proof that one day the right person would come. The official opening of what they were calling the Ashby Archive took place on the last Saturday of September, almost exactly 1 year after Greta had first driven east into the hills with a brass key in her jacket pocket. They had spent the intervening months restoring the schoolhouse to a condition that honored what it had been without pretending it was something other than what it was. The floors were cleaned and sealed. The windows were repaired. The bell tower was straightened by a contractor from Knoxville who refused to take full payment when he understood the purpose of the building. The register and all associated documentation were held at the University of Tennessee under formal archival conditions with digitized copies accessible through a dedicated portal that the graduate student had helped design. The physical schoolhouse remained what it had always been, a place for people to come. The morning of the opening was clear and cold, the hills at full autumn color, the sky a hard October blue. Greta stood at the door of the schoolhouse at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived and unlocked it with the brass key. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The room looked like itself. The desks had been arranged as they had always been in 4 rows, the carved initials still visible in the wood. The blackboard had been cleaned but not replaced. The teacher's desk stood where it had always stood. The filing cabinet, empty now of its secrets, stood open against the wall as a kind of testimony. She walked in and stood in the middle of the room and let it be quiet for a moment. She thought about the first time she had walked through this door 14 months ago, with nothing in her hands except a key and a collection of questions she had stopped believing would ever be answered. She thought about the feeling she had then of arriving somewhere she had always known existed. She did not try to explain what she felt now. Some things do not become clearer by being explained. The cars began arriving before 9. People came from neighboring counties and from other states, some of them traveling through the night to be here. They came carrying things, old photographs in paper bags, letters in shoeboxes, documents tucked inside books for safekeeping. Some of them had found answers in the archive already. Some of them were still looking. Some of them had come simply because they needed to stand in the place where someone had cared enough to keep a record. Marin arrived with Leland Langford, which surprised Greta until she thought about it, and then did not surprise her at all. Langford was in civilian clothes, as he had been on the porch at 3 in the morning. He was on administrative leave pending the federal review, which had moved faster than anyone had expected once the documentation reached the right desks. He looked lighter than he had the last time she saw him, the way a person looks when something they carried too long has finally been set down for good. Grantham was there with a photographer, working with the careful restraint of someone who understood that this was not primarily a story and that his presence here was a privilege, not a right. Chester Fenwick arrived at 10:30. Greta did not know who he was when he first appeared at the edge of the crowd outside the building. He was in his early 80s, moving with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to be thoughtful about his footing but had no intention of stopping. His face had the quality of someone who has spent a long time looking for something and has recently found it but is still adjusting to the weight of that. Langford saw him first and came to find Greta. "There's a man asking for you by name. He says he's the first name in the register." She found him near the door. He was holding a photograph, an old one, the edges soft from years of handling, the image slightly faded, but intact. He looked at her when she approached, and something in his expression settled, as if a question he had been carrying had just been answered without being asked. "Miss Morrow," he said, "my name is Chester Fenwick. I was 4 years old when Leroy Ashby put my name in that book." He held out the photograph. "I've been carrying this for a long time. I think it belongs to you." She took it carefully. It was a summer photograph outdoors, 2 people standing under a large tree in full leaf. Both of them, caught mid-laugh, turned slightly toward each other, their attention on something outside the frame. Simply 2 people in a moment of uncomplicated happiness, recorded by someone who had been there and had thought rightly that it was worth keeping. She recognized them from the formal photographs she had found in the folder. But those photographs had shown her parents as subjects, documented, recorded for official purposes. This one showed them as people, as Douglas and Florence Morrow, in a summer afternoon before the danger, for the choice, before the years of silence that would follow. She stood very still. "Leroy gave it to me for safekeeping," Chester said, 15 years ago. He said that if a young woman ever came looking, I should bring it to her. He said she would know who they were." He paused. "He was right about you coming. He was always right about the things that mattered." She turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was her parents'. The same deliberate strokes she had come to know over 14 months of reading their letters. But these words were not formal. They were not measured in the way that letters written for the future are measured. They were the words of 2 people writing to their daughter in the only form available to them, in the full knowledge that they might never have another opportunity. If Greta ever sees this, tell her she was never abandoned. Tell her she was loved every single day. Tell her we would have come back if we could. She read it once. She read it again. The noise of the crowd outside the voices and the movement of 100 people coming home to a place they had never been. All of it became distant. The October sunlight on the floorboards, the carved initials in the old desks, the teacher's desk where Leroy Ashby had sat for 40 years, keeping a promise no one had asked him to keep past the point of reason. All of it was present, and all of it was quiet. Chester Fenwick placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He did not say anything. He understood she thought that there was nothing useful to say, and that his presence was itself the message, the oldest name in the register standing beside her. In the room where the register lived, two people connected by the same man's 40 years of faithfulness. She did not wipe her face. She let it be what it was. After a while, she became aware that Marin was nearby, sitting in one of the old student chairs with her cane across her knees, watching with an expression that was not grief and was not joy, but was the particular expression of someone who has lived long enough to see something through to its end and is grateful for the privilege. He would have stood exactly here, Marin said quietly, at this time of year, looking at these hills. Greta looked out the window. The hills were full color red and orange and gold, the kind of color that only lasts a few weeks and then is gone and is more beautiful for the knowing of that. What would he have thought? She asked. Marin considered it genuinely the way she considered everything without rushing. He would have thought it was enough, she said. Not everything, not finished, but enough to justify the keeping of a promise. She paused. He was a practical man in most ways. He didn't need things to be perfect. He needed them to be real. Greta understood that. She had spent 20 years in pursuit of a story that made sense of her life, a clean explanation that resolved the pain into something legible. What she had found instead was messier and truer than any clean explanation could have been. A network of ordinary people making difficult choices. A man who had sat in this room for 40 years because he said he would. Parents who had chosen to be misunderstood by the person they loved most because misunderstanding was survivable and the alternative was not. And herself at 24 standing in the middle of it, not because she had been destined to be here, but because she had opened an envelope she was afraid to open and driven east into the hills and put a key in a lock. She went outside to speak. The crowd gathered on the grass around the schoolhouse, spilling into the Field families and individuals, and a few local officials who had driven up without being certain of their welcome and had been welcomed anyway. She stood on the porch steps where she could be seen. She had not prepared what she was going to say. She had considered it and decided against preparation because what she wanted to say was not something that benefited from being rehearsed. She looked out at the faces. When I came here last October, she began, I was looking for an explanation. I thought if I could understand why my parents made the choices they made, I would be able to stop asking the question I had been asking my whole life. She paused. The question was whether I had been loved. The field was very quiet. What I found was not a simple answer. It was evidence. 40 years of careful, unglamorous, unacknowledged evidence, kept by a man who had made a promise and had not broken it in a building that had no particular reason to still be standing, except that someone kept caring about it. She looked at the building behind her. Leroy Ashby never met me growing up. He never sent me a single letter to read while I was a child. He never showed up at a door and introduced himself. He just watched and kept records and waited because those were the things he had agreed to do. She looked back at the crowd. I spent 20 years believing that silence meant I was forgotten. I was wrong. Silence in this case was the form that keeping faith took. Some people keep faith loudly, and that matters. Some people keep it in the dark, in a room no one is watching over decades, and that matters too. Maybe it matters more, because it is the kind of faithfulness that does not depend on being seen. Chester Fenwick was near the front of the crowd. She looked at him and he nodded once, a slow and complete acknowledgement. The names in the register are real people. Some of them are here today. Some of them are still looking. Some of them will never be found. And that is a grief we have to hold along with everything else. She felt her voice steady itself from somewhere below the chest, from the place where decisions live rather than performances. But for the ones who can be found, we are going to keep looking. That is the work that was left here. That is what this building is for, and it is what I intend to do with whatever time I have in it. The applause that followed was not loud at first. It built the way things build when they are genuine from a few people and then more until it was the kind of sound that fills a space completely and leaves no room for doubt about what it means. She came down off the porch steps. Marin was there. Langford was a few feet away. Grantham had lowered his notebook. Chester Fenwick was looking at her with the expression of someone who has watched for a long time and has finally seen what they were looking for. The afternoon moved through its hours. People came in and out of the schoolhouse looking at the exhibit Grantham and the graduate student had assembled from photocopies of the register and selected documents reading the histories on the panels, sometimes stopping for a long time in front of a particular name. A man in his 70s stood in front of the panel that described the network's operation in the late 1990s, and Greta watched him read it twice and then stand with his hand flat against the wall beside it, not touching the panel, just standing close to it, as if proximity to the information was itself a form of contact with something he had been trying to reach for a very long time. She did not interrupt him. Some things needed to happen without witnesses. As the light began to angle low across the field and the crowd thinned to the people who did not want to leave, Greta walked the perimeter of the building alone. She put her hand on the clapboard siding, the old paint rough under her fingers. She looked up at the bell tower, straightened now, but still carrying in its lines the memory of the lean that 40 years of weather had put into it. She thought about the suitcase in the trunk of her car. It was still there. She had not unpacked it. She was not sure she was ready to unpack it, not sure what it would mean for the suitcase to finally go into a closet, whether that was something she was capable of, or whether the habit of readiness had become so much a part of her that removing it would take a kind of reconstruction she hadn't yet figured out how to do. But she noticed standing at the edge of the field with the hills going dark at their crests and the first stars coming into the sky above them, that the suitcase no longer felt like a statement. It no longer felt like preparation for departure. It felt for the first time like a thing that was simply there, a piece of luggage in a trunk, neither a plan nor a wound. That was something. That was, she thought, quite a lot. Marin found her there as the last of the cars were leaving. They stood together in the cooling air, without speaking for a moment, looking at the hills and the building, and the field where 100 people had stood today, and where for 40 years before that one man had stood alone. What does it feel like? Marin asked. Greta thought about it honestly. Like I've been walking towards something for a long time without knowing it, she said. And I've arrived. And it's not what I thought it would look like. And it's better. Marin nodded slowly. She reached over and touched Greta's arm, once briefly, the way you touch someone when words are present but unnecessary. They stood a little longer. The bell tower caught the last of the light and held it for a moment, the old wood going amber and then fading as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The schoolhouse settled into the evening with the patience of a building that has been through a great deal and has learned to take the long view. Greta put the brass key in her pocket the same way she had put it there 14 months ago, in a kitchen in Nashville, and felt it there familiar, now worn smooth in the places she had held it. She was not the girl who had sat on a staircase listening to other children open their presents. She was not the girl who had blown out a birthday candle alone in a parking lot. She was not the girl who had kept the suitcase packed because she had learned that hope made leaving harder. She was the person Leroy Ashby had believed would come, the person her parents had written a letter to hoping someday she would understand what they had done and why. The person Chester Fenwick had carried a photograph across decades to find. She had not been abandoned. She had been hidden in the only safe place available in the assumption of the world that she did not matter. And she had lived, and she had come back, and the records were safe, and the work was real, and the door of the schoolhouse was unlocked. She turned and walked back inside to begin. Behind her, the bell tower held its straightened line against the darkening sky. The schoolhouse windows caught the last light and threw it back briefly like a signal. 40 years of patience distilled into one illuminated moment, then gone as the ridge swallowed the sun. Inside, the register sat on the teacher's desk where it had always been. Hundreds of names, hundreds of people who had once been recorded here and then scattered and then slowly one by one returned. The ink that spelled her own name had faded to the color of old leaves, but it was legible. It would remain legible for a long time yet. Greta set the brass key on the desk beside the register. Tomorrow she would carry it in her pocket again. Tonight she left it there in the room where Leroy Ashby had kept it for 40 years, resting on the wood he had kept clean, in the place he had kept open, because some promises do not end when the person who made them is gone. They end when the work is finished. And the work was not finished.